Previously on The Coverup.
I don't have classified clearance. I'm a scientist, not a national security person. So I don't have direct visibility. But I have been paying very close attention to the public rhetoric from many of the people in the security community, national security community, about COVID, about the lab leak. Wouldn't be at all surprising to know that there was, in fact, a lot of national security infrastructure behind this research agenda.
In my last conversation with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, he hinted that there may be more to the COVID cover-up story than just public health.
Why is DARPA funding this?
It is much more likely that it is a natural occurrence from an animal to a human.
Social distancing is absolutely critical. And if you can't social distance and you're outside, you must wear a mask.
The NIH and NIAID categorically has not funded gain-of-function research to be conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science.
Today, I'm headed into the belly of the beast, the United States Senate, to find out more. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the political class in Washington, D.C. mostly ran cover for the administration, supporting the official narrative and criticizing dissenters as cranks and conspiracy theorists. But from the beginning, one man has doggedly sought to get to the truth. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky gained prominence in the COVID debate after a series of fiery confrontations with Dr. Anthony Fauci, facing questions about his role in funding the dangerous gain-of-function research that now looks to have caused the pandemic.
If the point that you are making is that the grant that was funded as a sub-award from EcoHealth to Wuhan created SARS-CoV-2, that's where you are getting. Let me finish.
We don't know.
Well,
we don't
wait
know
a minute.
If it did come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
He even went so far as to call the senator a liar to his face.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating, Senator.
When I first asked him about, did you fund gain-of-function research, we presented him with the name of the paper, with the name and number from his agency at NIH saying he funded it. I would have thought he would have said, yes, we funded this, and we didn't realize how dangerous it would be. Instead, it was the absolute, denial. Scientists in the U.S. have long known how to mutate animal viruses to infect humans. For years, Dr. Ralph Barrick, a virologist in the U.S., has been collaborating with Dr. Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Virology Institute, sharing his discoveries about how to create superviruses. This gain-of-function research has been funded by the NIH. I guess I was surprised that he absolutely denied it unequivocally, and then really sort of went on the offensive attacking me. Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research.
So I was surprised at that. I thought he would just own up to it. But I think from the beginning he knew that if he wasn't successful with the cover-up, that he would go down in history as having funded and supported research that led to a worldwide pandemic, killing maybe 15 to 20 million people. That's an extraordinary thing to be remembered for, and I think that will be his punishment in history, is at least part of his epitaph will be that he funded dangerous research in China that may have led to a pandemic, that may have led to the deaths of millions of people. We came back about 3 weeks later and we had more evidence and we wanted to re-bring this up. And we reminded him from the outset that it's a felony to lie to Congress, and do you want to retract those words? Section 1001 of the U.S. Criminal Code creates a felony and a 5-year penalty for lying to Congress. On your last trip to our committee on May 11th, You stated that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And yet, gain-of-function research was done entirely in the Wuhan Institute by Dr. Shi and was funded by the NIH. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the Wuhan virology paper entitled Discovery of a Rich Gene Pool of Bat SARS-Related Coronaviruses. In this paper, she took 2 bat coronavirus genes, spike genes, and combined them with a SARS-related backbone to create new viruses that are not found in nature. These lab-created viruses were then shown to replicate in humans. Viruses that in nature only infect animals were manipulated in the Wuhan lab to gain the function of infecting humans. This research fits the definition of the research that the NIH said was subject to the pause in 2014 to 2017, a pause in funding on gain of function. Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans,
right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. You get one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
People who saw that exchange were somewhat surprised because he wants to present himself as this mild-mannered, Sesame Street kind of granddad thing. But I think people who saw that, many of the commenters saw that when he said that he lied.
Lying in front of Congress is a felony that would quickly land any ordinary citizen in prison. So I'm forced to wonder, why has Dr. Fauci faced no consequences for his actions?
We've referred him. I've referred him to the Department of Justice 3 times. We've detailed his lies to Congress, which are a felony. And I've sort of tragically and jokingly said if he were a member of the Trump administration, he'd have been arrested long ago, because I think we have 2 standards of justice. One of the amazing things, though, if you look at people online, when I bring these things up, the response will be, well, how come you just talk about it? All you do is talk about it. It's like, well, I'm not with the Department of Justice. I would arrest him. I would prosecute him. I don't have that power. But it's funny how the frustration across America, a lot of people are frustrated and they want you to, well, how come you don't do anything? And it's like, well, I am doing things. I'm trying to do oversight. I'm trying to look at the information. I'm trying to expose it. But I don't have prosecutorial power. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They're like, why aren't you putting him in jail? It's like, it's not for lack of trying. I've referred him 3 times to the Department of Justice.
Is Anthony Fauci a made man?
He certainly seems to be protected. I think the Democrats, the reason the Democrats, I think, coalesced around him is that he represents government, and they think government is the answer to most things. And I think they don't want any attack on him as an attack on central planning or attack on government. But there's probably never been a guy that's been more protected in a way. He received a $1 million prize while he was still a bureaucrat. He was being paid more than the president. He's being paid $450,000 a year. His wife gets over $200,000 a year. Together, they make about $800,000 a year. That's pretty good bureaucrat work, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I think he, in some ways, is a made man. I think a lot of us think, well, scientists want to cure cancer and they're noble people and they're not very political. But when you read their internal emails between Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and Anthony Fauci, a head of a portion of the NIH, where they're saying to each other, we need to take down Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff. We need to take them down. And Fauci responding, well, look at this article I got printed in Wired where we tear them up. And then one of Fauci's assistants saying, I'm the guy. Anthony Fauci doesn't want his fingers on it. When he didn't want his fingers on it, and we don't want his name in the New York Times, you come to me and I'll give you the dirt. These don't sound like scientists, they sound like mobsters. So for him to call me a liar, it's sort of consistent with who he is, but it's not the persona he presents. He's, in the end, these are people that had $1 billion turf. Robert Kennedy wrote a lot about the intersection between Anthony Fauci's funding and the biological weapons research that's going on, and how his budget became 100-fold bigger after 9/11. You know how 9/11 caused a lot of overreaction? One of the overreactions was to give Anthony Fauci more money and allow him more power and more ability to get involved in biological weapons.
So is he a public health official or is he a national security official?
I think he pretends to be a public health official, and he would never even probably acknowledge the other part of it. But this is a guy who makes frequent trips to Langley to visit the CIA.
According to information gathered by the Select Subcommittee, Dr. Anthony Fauci, then director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, played a role in the Central Intelligence Agency's review of the origins of COVID-19.
This is a guy who is, in all likelihood, conversant with weapon systems that we still don't even know of. You know, we voted unanimously in the Senate and in the House to declassify all the material and release it to the public. Almost nothing happened from that. There was a short little snippet that the Biden administration put forward that revealed nothing. Most of the information I've been trying to get for the last 3 years is already declassified. We've got nothing. But when we start looking into defense agencies, we get less than nothing.
With no cooperation from any of the relevant agencies, we have to rely on whistleblowers for information. One source from the CIA claims that there was a deliberate attempt to disguise the fact that the COVID virus very probably originated in a lab.
The accusation is that 7 scientists were convened and they were asked the question, as they were in every intelligence agency, look at the intelligence and what is your conclusion? Do you think this, with what degree of confidence, do you think this came from nature or from the lab? FBI said moderate confidence, we think it came from the lab.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
DOE, either low or moderate confidence also. CIA, the initial vote, the whistleblower says, was 6-1, saying that it actually came from the lab.
According to the whistleblower, at the end of its review, 6 of the 7 members of the team believed the intelligence and science were sufficient to make a low confidence assessment that COVID-19 originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China,
and that they were overruled by senior CIA officials.
The whistleblower further contends that to come to the eventual public determination of uncertainty, the other 6 members were given a significant monetary incentive to change their position.
We also have rumors that Anthony Fauci was visiting CIA headquarters at this time as well. We're not sure if he's in the logbook or not. There are some accusations that he doesn't get logged in when he goes to the CIA. But they vote 6-1 to say it comes from the lab, and then they're reversed.
4 IC elements in the National Intelligence Council assess with low confidence that the initial SARS-CoV-2 infection was most likely caused by natural exposure to an animal infected with it or a close progenitor virus.
The whistleblower says that there was a dispute, and a dispute within an agency. They have a person called an ombudsman, and they asked that person to adjudicate this dispute, and he sided with the senior officers. And George Carlin says, you know, for a conspiracy, it's not necessary that you have people in a room all rubbing their hands together. For a conspiracy to occur, all you have to have is that interests converge. And the interests that converge here is they all funded this research. They all knew about this research. Nobody told the public. Nobody warned us. A pandemic occurs, so everybody has a natural instinct to now hide the ball, hide the information. Don't let anybody know that this funding was out there and that you knew anything about it.
A year ago, you were expressing great frustration about getting access to basic documents, and you would first be told they didn't exist, and then you were told that eventually they did exist, and eventually you could look at them, but you couldn't actually use a doctor. Tell that story.
We have two documents that are 250 pages long, and I wish I had them here for you, but they're completely redacted. They're not classified and completely redacted. We finally were allowed to look at one about a week ago in camera, which means you have to go to the office and you can look at it there, but you can't take it out of the office, which means my staff can go, but you're somewhat limited if you can't actually read through things, read through them again, try to reference it. And it's a way of them trying to stymie the oversight by saying you can't have these documents. And none of it's classified, which makes us think there's something there that's being hidden. But some of it's difficult to discern, and this is why investigation is hard. So, for example, one of the biggest clues we got that there was a cover-up was in 2018. There was a project called Diffuse, and it was proposed by the Wuhan lab, Ralph Barrick in North Carolina, and Peter Daszak, head of EcoHealth Alliance. They wanted to create a virus, a coronavirus, and put a special cleavage site in it called a furin cleavage site to make it more infectious to humans. Well, people, once they saw the sequence of COVID, they're like, wow, that looks just like what COVID is. And there hadn't been a virus like this in nature that had this special cleavage site right where it needed to be. And they're like, oh my goodness, there was a proposal for this. But none of the people associated with the proposal told us the only reason we found out about this, a whistleblower, a Lieutenant Colonel Marine in the Defense Department working in one of these agencies, came across it. And he didn't come across it easily. He looked for it thinking it might be there, and it was missing. The file was empty. And then there was more ramifications, and he said he saw me having an interaction with Fauci, and he went back to the file and it appeared. And what he found was this proposal. Well, we just discovered about 3 weeks ago that this proposal to create a virus that looks just like COVID-19 was presented to 15 agencies. And so you scratch your head and you say, well, once COVID came out and they saw the sequence and they said, wow, I remember having a proposal about that 2 years ago and it didn't get funded, but I think they wanted to create something that looks just like this. Wouldn't alarm bells have come off and you would have come forward and said to the country, I think I have some information here? Not one of these bureaucrats came forward. Early February of 2020, February 1st, there's a big meeting. Fauci, famous virologist.
From Francis Collins. Thank you to everyone for joining. There's clearly much to understand in this. This call was very helpful to hear some of our current understanding and the many gaps in our knowledge.
And these are the ones that are all communicating back and forth. Man, I'm worried. This looks like it's been manipulated. This looks like it came from the lab. This looks like a lab accident.
From Jeremy Farrar to Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci, Eddie would be a 60-40 lab side. I remain a 50-50.
That's what they're saying privately. Within 3 days, the same people saying this privately have written a paper completely dispelling it as nonsense and saying it's a crazy notion. And they actually write the words in the paper. They say, COVID is not could be or might not be, COVID is not a laboratory construct. Some of these people, Christian Anderson's one of them, about 2 months later get a $9 million grant approved personally by Anthony Fauci, signed off by Anthony Fauci, $9 million. Most of these people have had millions of dollars. EcoHealth Alliance is to this day still getting more money. We think they probably worked with the lab that created this virus, and yet EcoHealth Alliance is still getting taxpayer money. They should be forever lifetime ban on getting any money. They should be dissolved as a corporation, and yet they're still getting our money. I think there's probably never before been a cover-up in our country so fully exposed. because we hear all of their private conversations now. It took us a year or so, or two to get them. The federal court had to mandate this, but through their communications, we now know that privately, everything they were saying publicly, they were saying the opposite privately. There is a full-throated debate, though, over the dangerousness of this research. Richard Ebright has been talking about this. He's a professor at Rutgers. I think he has 175 peer-reviewed papers. He was a 17-year editor of a scientific journal, the Journal of Molecular Pathology. And he started getting involved in this debate before 2010 because they had taken the bird flu and they were trying to make the bird flu more infectious to humans. And he said, oh, this is a crazy notion. It has a 50% mortality in humans. We're just lucky it doesn't infect humans very well. Who in their right mind would want to try to make it more infectious to humans? So he was calling and sounding the alarm on this kind of research for a decade.
With respect to the gain-of-function research, which creates new threats, biological threats that do not exist currently and might not naturally come into existence in a decade, a century, or a millennium, that research creates threats, and those threats are existentially risky threats. And that research is being conducted without a justifiable rationale. There is no rationale in terms of development of countermeasures. Industry develops vaccines and therapeutics against diseases currently in humans, not against diseases that don't yet exist and need to be made in a lab.
How important is it that we actually have a law passed and that we actually have regulators that are scientists, but that are outside of the supply of money, outside of the exchange of grant money?
I think it's a matter of survival. It's that important.
The left wants to make it as if they are the sole repository of science. Anthony Fauci said, I am science. And when you criticize Anthony Fauci, you are criticizing science.
They're really criticizing science because I represent science.
But science is never that way. Anybody who says that really isn't a scientist. Scientist is not really about consensus. It's about disputation. And it's about trying to prove your point. And it was Einstein who said, I'm always one experiment away from being disproven. Come up with an experiment, you disprove my hypothesis, you win. And that's the ongoing nature of science. I think some of them recognize the dangers. In fact, Fauci was asked about this. In 2012, he was asked, well, what if a pandemic should occur? If a lab leak should cause a pandemic? And he says, even if a scientist got infected and a pandemic occurred, it would be worth it. The knowledge would be worth the risk. And I think a lot of people had somebody die in the pandemic of COVID would probably disagree with that and think it was a really bad judgment. In fact, I really think that Fauci's judgment on this whole thing, not just covering it up, but the judgment to move forward with this is such poor judgment that it should be remembered really in the history of modern medical decisions of maybe one of the worst decisions ever made.
Do these bureaucrats and their ecosystem of nonprofits and scientific institutions, do they actually feel any accountability to you as a legislator or the American taxpayers that are funding it all?
No. I think most of them have resisted everything other than a court order. Almost all of the information has not been gotten voluntarily. They've all lawyered up, and only information we get is from Freedom of Information Act.
Who do these agencies answer to if not Congress?
I think the disturbing thing is no one. They should answer to us. Congress's job is to oversee these agencies, but they appear to answer to no one.
So people hearing you say that the U.S. government is still funding Peter Daszak and EcoHealth, then we probably know that he did gain-of-function research. Like, why? Like, how is that still happening?
It boggles the mind. I mean, it also goes to, though, when you point out something bad in government, you think it would change. We'll elect Republicans, then we'll elect Democrats. You're like, well, why doesn't anything ever change? We have different branches of government. We have executive, legislative, and judicial, and there's supposed to be checks and balances on each other. But let's say I want documents from the president. I can't make him. That's what I want. I want documents from HHS and NIH on the deliberation of gain and function. They won't give it to me. How do I make them? Now, there is one way I could make them, and that would be the power of the purse. the Appropriations Committee the chairman of it would call up the White House and say, guess what? It's going to slow to a crawl, or we're just going to put a delay on stuff. We're going to gum the works up. And they can gum the works up for weeks or months. They could reduce their appropriation. But we don't have anybody that has the intestinal fortitude to do that. Most of the people on the spending committees are for spending. That's why they're on the spending committee, and so they're never for withholding the spending to get something. And so as a consequence, the executive branch just does what they want. And they basically, and that's not even including the intelligence agencies. So this is non-intelligence agencies, HHS resisting us. You get to the intelligence agencies, and it's 10 times harder because they just say it's a national secret. We can't tell you. Or they tell you in a classified setting, and that prevents you from making the argument publicly.
So we work for them.
Yeah, I mean, is there a deep state? You're damn right there's a deep state, but it's also a bureaucracy too. It's a deep bureaucracy. And I think that would be a much more boring way of putting it. And the left would have a tougher time saying it doesn't exist and everybody's crazy talking about the deep state. But that's essentially what the deep state is. It's a deep bureaucracy. It's a bureaucracy that goes on generation after generation. And these are people that are unelected and unresponsive to elections. And it's why people are frustrated as voters. We vote to change. It's exactly the same. Then we vote for another party to change, and it's exactly the same. It's because of the apparatus of government is so large, immutable, and just you never seem to be able to budget one way or the other.
Now, as I understand it, you have legislation that basically codifies the ban on gain of function.
What it would do is it has to be people judging this who don't receive the money. So Anthony Fauci and all of his cronies were both dispensing and receiving money, and it was in an opaque process. What we want is to get it outside of NIH, outside of HHS, and it will be an independent commission with the ability to look at any research anywhere in government. The previous commission they set up was called the P3CO Committee, Potential Pandemic Pathogens, or the 3 Ps. It was set up to look at dangerous research, but then it didn't have the power to go looking for it. You had to volunteer. You said, oh, well, I've got gain of function. Do you want to look at my research? So they looked at 3 research projects during the Trump administration. But this is why it becomes intriguing. Fauci sending emails till 3 in the morning. The last one at 3 in the morning is to a guy named Bob Cadillac. He was the chairman of the P3CO committee that was supposed to have looked at dangerous research but never did. Why is Anthony Fauci lying awake at 3 in the morning, sending emails and sending an article that says, well, nothing to see here, looks like it came from nature? Because he's wanting to reassure this person who didn't get to review it that guess what? It just came from nature. You don't have to worry about whether you saw this or not. Eventually, though, Bob Cadillac ends up leading a Senate Minority Commission that studies this for a year and a half and concludes that he thinks it came from the lab. This virus killed 0.3%. That isn't to downplay the deaths. 1 million Americans died either from or with COVID, and that's a lot of people. I know people who died from COVID, and yet 0.3% is nothing compared to 50% or 30%. We do know that they're doing research in foreign countries, but also in our country, with Ebola, with Nipah, with viruses that have a 50% mortality. If one of those gets out, we're talking about something so devastating that most people can't even imagine. I was saying this to someone the other day, that what would happen with 50%, and they said, no, 10% would devastate the world. Because think about it. What happens to sewage? What happens to potable water? What happens to the chlorination of the water? Can you imagine, what would happen? And in our big cities with people so close together, we would descend into utter chaos and anarchy, I think within weeks. If something were killing off 50% of the people.
If these dangers are not addressed, if Fauci and the other bureaucrats responsible for the cover-up are not held accountable, the consequences could be catastrophic. But for all Senator Paul's efforts, it seems like we're making very little progress. Federal agencies continue to stonewall, while many Americans just want to forget what happened and move on with their lives. I can't help wondering, is there any hope of avoiding a repeat of this public health disaster?
One reason for me to keep beating the drum on this over and over again, and to propose legislation to have more controls on this, is that I think I am winning the argument. I think that in April of 2020, in the very beginning, when all these scientists were saying, oh yeah, no way, you're crazy if you think it came from the lab, I was probably in the 1 percentile. And actually, even I wasn't thinking about it at the beginning of 2020. It took me almost a year to really get involved in this. But now with all the debate, my book, other people's books that have been written, Alina Chan's Viral is a great book. Whatever Happened in Wuhan is a great book. There's a bunch of books out on this now that I think the public's come around. I think the public, actually, the majority of the public believes this came from the lab. We have to translate that win over the argument into a win over legislation. And that win over legislation, to me, would be much greater restrictions on taxpayer money going into this dangerous research. You know, there are some successes, and I think it's important for us not to get discouraged. The first success is on vaccine mandates. I'm against all vaccine mandates, but by and large, mandates in the government have gone unnoticed, and we've just allowed the military to be forced into these mandates. For the first time, a unified Republican caucus and some Democrats actually voted to overturn a mandate. So it's the first time in our history we have overcome a vaccine mandate. So the people in our military are not required to have the COVID vaccine. And I can't tell you how many people I've met who were 19 years in, 16 years in, 17 years in, close to retirement, who have thanked me for allowing them to finish their career because they did not want to get vaccinated. So we had a bill passed out unanimously out of my Homeland Security Committee that says that if you receive royalties from Big Pharma, you have to reveal them. This was another contentious exchange that you would think Bernie Sanders and all the progressive left who are skeptical of Big Pharma would have been on my side, but I didn't hear from one of them, is that I challenged Fauci on his royalties, and I challenged him to reveal. The FDA and the CDC have vaccine committees that approve vaccines. Are there any scientists on those committees that have actually receiving royalties from the same people who make the vaccines?
Can you tell me that you have not received a royalty from any entity that you ever oversaw the distribution of money in research grants?
And he says, we don't have to tell you. I mean, it was an incredibly arrogant response. He said, essentially to the American public, it's none of your business. But he pointed to a law and said, we don't have to.
According to the regulations, people who receive royalties are not required to divulge them even on their financial statement, according to the Bayh-Dole Act.
And I told him at the time, we'll change that law. So we passed unanimously, it's not a law yet, but we passed this bill unanimously that they have to report, so basically a sunshine, they have to report their royalties on these committees, and we included a bunch of committees that haven't had to. It's still a step forward, we gotta try to get that passed. But those are progress. The big progress, the big bill I want to pass, though, will ultimately be on restricting and restraining taxpayer funding of gain of function. That's still unknown. Nothing will stop me from continuing this fight. I'm going to rifle through and examine every bit of records on COVID until we finally get the truth.
You know, Morenz has now admitted to destroying evidence, basically, which is a felony. He also mentions in one of the emails that he talked to Tony, and he thinks Tony's deleted all his emails too.
Yeah.
And he says communicate with Tony through email, or I'll hand carry stuff to his house.
Yeah.
I mean, the stuff's just out of this world. Hand carrying messages, it's sort of like Al Qaeda. How does Al Qaeda transmit their messages? By courier.
So do they have burner phones?
Well, that's in Farrar's book. He says, I got a burner phone. I didn't know what one was, and I got a burner phone early on.
So much has happened since the last time we talked just a couple days ago, but it feels like the dominoes are starting to fall. Let's start with defunding, debarment of EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak. What's going on?
So the research from the beginning was EcoHealth Alliance with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You got China, EcoHealth Alliance, which is in New York, run by Peter Daszak, with Ralph Barrick out of UNC. They're all working on this gain of function research for probably a decade. Well, we've been saying there's corruption there from the beginning, and they haven't been honest about it. Finally, in the last 2 weeks, NIH is now agreeing with us. NIH has said no more taxpayer money for EcoHealth.
And today they announced that Peter Daszak as well is getting will get no more taxpayer money. This is a step forward, and this is finally the NIH admitting that what we've been talking about is serious business.
They've admitted that they have been funding gain-of-function research even after having denied it all these years.
The acting head of the NIH was Lawrence Tabak for a long time. They interviewed him in a House hearing recently.
Did NIH fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth?
Yes, we did. Research that goes on in many, many labs around the country. It is not regulated, and the reason it's not regulated is it poses no threat or harm to anybody.
So he admits that it was gain-of-function research, but he also admits that what was going on around this, deleting emails. So we have Tony Fauci deleting emails. We also have his fixer. Tony Fauci's Michael Cohen is a guy named David Morenz, and he's the guy who was also deleting emails, talking to other people at the NIH and saying, oh, I visited with the FOIA lady. She's taught me how to avoid FOIA and delete things so they can't get it from my records. That's directly evading the law. And then when he talks about deleting emails in this context, that's destroying evidence. So we think now that he's guilty of a felony, destroying evidence, but we also think Tony Fauci is as well. So we've sent a letter today asking for the Department of Justice to have a criminal investigation of David Morenz, who is Anthony Fauci's fixer.
It feels like the dominoes are starting to fall and the bad guys are starting to be shed light on.
We'll see. I mean, it ultimately, for any of this to go any further, it takes someone to actually take legal action. So David Morenz, the fixer, the guy that's deleting all these emails, yeah, he is still not been fired. They've had him on unpaid leave, we think. They won't actually give us a direct answer, but we think for over a year. What's he doing on unpaid leave? Why, no disciplinary action? So when they asked the NIH, was this the policy? Was he obeying policy, deleting emails? Was the FOIA lady obeying policy by teaching him to delete emails? And the guy frankly says no. So if there is anybody left with integrity at the NIH, our hope is that they will at the very least begin to fire people, discipline people. You know, you shouldn't be allowed to be working for government if you're a liar and a thief and if you're destroying evidence. And, you know, this cabal is a big deal though. I mean, they talk about in the exchanges of emails, this David Morenz, who's Anthony Fauci's fixer, he says, I can hand carry messages to him. I can get messages to him. You know, maybe disappearing ink, I don't know. They also say, call Tony on his private phone. I usually do, which is also, you're not supposed to be talking government business on the private phone. They know Fauci was using private Gmail. My recommendation to the House COVID Committee, which has subpoena power, they need to subpoena now all of Tony Fauci's private emails. They have David Morenz, but now he's communicating with Anthony Fauci, not on government email, which the law says, but on private email. They need to be going after Tony Fauci's private emails. There's more smoking guns to be seen here.
So burner phones, hand-delivered packages, sounds kind of
Sounds like international espionage.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the kind of thing of fiction. But the idea that they're showing up at people's houses with, you know, handwritten messages, burn this after you read it, you know, burner phones, it's bizarre. It's more than I would ever have expected. But I've told people, and I stick by this, I think the NIH is more secretive and holding more secrets on this than the CIA, the FBI, or any other agency. We've had more cooperation from the CIA and the FBI than we have from the NIH. They have refused at every turn to reveal any information. All I want to see, one of the things I want to see, is the debate over whether or not that research in China was gain of function. They have a meeting. We know there are minutes to the meeting. We've seen copies of it, all whited out. We want to see the debate. And that's an honest thing to see. What scientists argued it wasn't, what scientists argued that it was gain of function, because they made a terrible mistake. Even if it was an honest mistake, they made a terrible mistake to fund research that in all likelihood led to the deaths of 15 million people.
disgusting behavior, but this has to feel like vindication.
Yeah, the ultimate vindication for me will be if we pass legislation to prevent this from happening again. There's still a lot of dangerous research going on around the world, including a lot that we fund. I want to make sure that there's nobody trying to make Ebola into a respiratory virus, to transmit it by air. That shouldn't be happening. I'm not convinced that it isn't happening. We have a lot of secretive programs. We have classified programs. I'm having trouble getting the information for the non-classified programs. You can imagine what's going on in the bioweapons sphere that I have no access to.
I'm just getting started with this. The investigation, as far as I'm concerned, is just getting started. I will not let go of this. I will insist, and I will get all of the information on COVID, and there ultimately will be repercussions for these people, but my ultimate goal is to make sure this never happens again.
If there was this much incompetence and corruption from the NIH during COVID, I have to wonder if the same is true for the White House COVID task force. I'm going to speak with Scott Atlas on the next episode, who's had firsthand experience working with Dr. Fauci and Deborah Birx. Next time on The Cover-Up.